May 22, 1959, radio recorder studio in Hollywood, California. A 29-year-old saxophonist walks through the door carrying an instrument that looks like a toy, a cream-colored plastic alto saxophone he bought 5 years earlier because he couldn't afford brass. His name is Randolph Denard Ornette Coleman, and in the next several hours, he will record 6 compositions that will fracture the jazz world in half. The music industry has seen revolutionaries before, but what makes this story different is that Ornette Coleman wasn't trying to destroy jazz. He was trying to free it from a cage that nobody else could see. Born March 9, 1930, in Fort Worth, Texas, Ornette grew up in the Bottoms, a segregated neighborhood northeast of downtown, where the air hung thick with the blues and the weight of Jim Crow. His father, Randolph, died when Ornette was 7, leaving his mother, Rosa, to raise 3 children on a seamstress's wages. At 14, Ornette begged his mother for a saxophone. Rosa made a deal: shine enough shoes, press enough clothes, save enough pennies, and the horn would be his. Ornette took every job he could find. When he finally held that tenor saxophone, he taught himself to play by listening to the radio, figuring out fingerings from a piano instruction book. At I.M. Terrell High School, he joined the band, briefly. During a performance of John Philip Sousa's The Washington Post, Ornette started improvising. The band director dismissed him on the spot. It was Ornette's first lesson. His music didn't fit the rules. He formed a group called the Jam Jivers, with friends Prince Lasha and Charles Moffett, playing rhythm and blues around Fort Worth. But even in R&B bands, band leaders complained. Ornette's solos wandered off the chord changes. His tone was raw, vocalized, nothing like the smooth alto players on the radio. In 1949, eager to escape Texas, Ornette joined a traveling show called Silas Green from New Orleans. The gig took him to Louisiana. After one performance in Baton Rouge, angry audience members followed him out of the venue. They beat him severely and destroyed his tenor saxophone. Hospitalized and broke, Ornette made his way to New Orleans with a touring show. His tenor was gone. With borrowed money, he bought an alto saxophone, the instrument that would become his voice for the rest of his life. But New Orleans offered no refuge. When Ornette sat in at jam sessions, veteran musicians walked off the bandstand. Some threw drinks, others simply unplugged their instruments mid-song. The message was clear: his music was wrong. Ornette moved to Los Angeles in 1950, joining Pee Wee Crayton's band. The pattern repeated: fired from gigs, booed at jam sessions, told he didn't know his instrument. By 1952, Ornette took a day job as an elevator operator at a department store. Every lunch break, he studied harmony textbooks in the stockroom. But Los Angeles held something Texas and Louisiana didn't: a handful of musicians who heard something different in Ornette's sound. Trumpeter Don Cherry, only 19, recognized a kindred spirit. Bassist Charlie Hayden, raised on folk music, understood Ornette's melodic approach. Drummer Billy Higgins could follow the shifting rhythms. Drummer Ed Blackwell and trumpeter Bobby Bradford joined the circle. They rehearsed obsessively in Ornette's tiny apartment, working without a piano or guitar, chordal instruments that would lock them into conventional harmony. The music they created ignored the rulebook of bebop. No chord changes dictating where solos could go. No rigid song forms, just melodies that evolved organically. Conversations between instruments, democracy instead of hierarchy. In 1954, Ornette bought a white plastic Grafton alto saxophone for $40, all he could afford. The instrument was brittle with an unusual spongy action, and it produced a harsh, reedy tone. Most saxophonists would have rejected it immediately. Ornette embraced it. The plastic horn became an extension of his voice, crying, wailing, singing the blues in ways brass couldn't capture. Years later, he would say the plastic saxophone allowed him to continually create my own sound. During a lunch break from his department store job in the early 1950s, Ornette wandered into an art gallery. A painting stopped him cold. A wealthy white woman surrounded by luxury, yet her face held the most profound loneliness he had ever witnessed. He stood before that portrait, recognizing an emotion that transcended race and class: the universal ache of isolation. That afternoon, Ornette went home and composed "Lonely Woman." The piece would become his most famous composition, a standard covered by everyone from the modern jazz quartet to Pat Metheny. But in 1954, it was just another song that made jazz musicians uncomfortable. The Los Angeles jazz scene had no place for Ornette Coleman. But in 1958, bassist Red Mitchell brought him to meet Lester Koenig at Contemporary Records. Koenig listened to Ornette's compositions and heard something remarkable. Not chaos, but a new logic. He signed Ornette immediately. The resulting album, Something Else. The music of Ornette Coleman divided critics. Some heard innovation, others heard incompetence. But the album reached the ears of John Lewis, pianist and director of the modern jazz quartet, one of the most respected figures in jazz. Lewis heard genius. He invited Ornette and Don Cherry to attend the Lenox School of Jazz in Massachusetts in the summer of 1959, covering their tuition. More importantly, Lewis persuaded Atlantic Records producer Nesuhi Ertegun to sign Coleman to a recording contract. It was a controversial decision. Even at Lenox, faculty members questioned Lewis's judgment. Trombonist Bob Brookmeyer later recalled wanting to leave the faculty entirely because of Ornette's presence. Guitarist Attila Zoller, rooming with Ornette and Don Cherry, described getting into a lot of arguments about this stupid kind of playing. But others understood. Gunther Schuller, teaching music history, played Ornette recordings of Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong. Ornette responded with childlike wonder. This was his heritage, and he hadn't fully known it. Composer George Russell saw Ornette as pointing toward jazz's future. On August 29, 1959, the Lenox School held its annual concert. Martin Williams, co-editor of the Jazz Review, attended. His review described Ornette as a driving force whose innovations would affect the whole character of jazz music profoundly and pervasively. The praise meant little to Ornette. In June 1959, he had told Nesuhi Ertegun he was considering abandoning music entirely to study religion. Ertegun urged him to reconsider. Make one album first, then decide. That album would be recorded on May 22, 1959, in a single day at Radio Recorders in Hollywood. Radio Recorders on Santa Monica Boulevard had witnessed countless legendary sessions. But nothing prepared engineer Bones Howe for what walked through the door on May 22, 1959. Ornette Coleman arrived with his working quartet. Don Cherry on pocket trumpet, Charlie Haydn on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. No piano, no guitar, no harmonic foundation that jazz musicians relied on like gravity. Nesuhi Ertegun, Atlantic's jazz producer, had chosen the album's title, The Shape of Jazz to Come. Ornette had wanted to call it Focus on Sanity after one of the compositions. But Ertegun recognized marketing gold, a title that promised listeners a glimpse of the future. The recording session moved with surprising efficiency. These four musicians had spent years rehearsing together, developing an almost telepathic communication. They knew Ornette's compositions intimately, not as fixed chord progressions but as melodic templates that could support infinite variations. Lonely Woman opened the session. Charlie Haydn began with a slow, dirge-like bass line at approximately 60 beats per minute. Then Billy Higgins entered with fast, shuffling drums, around 325 beats per minute. The juxtaposition was deliberately disorienting, creating what musicologists would later call a temporal mystery. Over this dual-tempo foundation, Ornette and Don Cherry played the melody in unison, a haunting, folk-like theme in B minor. Their intonation was raw, slightly out of tune by conventional standards, bending notes the way blues singers bent words. The melody seemed to float, untethered from the rhythm section's pulse. When Ornette soloed, he didn't follow chord changes. There were none to follow. Instead, he improvised on the melody's emotional contour, its shapes and colors. Cherry's responses didn't comp like a pianist providing harmonic support. He played counter melodies, engaging in real-time conversation. Hayden's bass didn't walk through chord progressions. It created long, sustained drones, sometimes shifting unexpectedly to new tonal centers without warning. Higgins's drums propelled the music forward while maintaining that frenetic pulse, never losing the pocket even as the front line wandered. Eventually came next, a fast bebop vehicle but with Coleman's phraseology running wild. Where Charlie Parker would have navigated chord changes with mathematical precision, Ornette played frenzied clouds of 30-second notes that defied harmonic analysis. Yet somehow it swung. Peace offered a gentle contrast, light, elegant, almost pastoral. Cherry and Coleman stated the theme with delicate brushwork from Higgins and brief arcobass from Hayden. The alto solo that followed demonstrated Ornette's melodic gift, simple, direct, deeply lyrical. Focus on Sanity and Congeniality showcased Ornette's compositional genius, themes that skipped between keys and grooves without traditional transitions. The heads would shift from bebop to chorale-like passages and back, creating cohesion from contrast. Chronology closed the session, its title suggesting Ornette's awareness that he was documenting a moment in time, a before and after moment for jazz itself. 6 compositions, 38 minutes of music, recorded in a single day with minimal overdubs. When the session ended, Ornette thanked Ertegun and left the studio with his plastic saxophone case, uncertain if anyone would care. 2 outtakes from the session, Monk and the Nun and Just For You, wouldn't see official release until the 1970s. They remain buried treasures, revealing even more of Coleman's compositional approach. Atlantic pressed the album with striking cover art. A stark black and white photograph by William Claxton, showing Ornette holding his white plastic saxophone, his face serious, almost defiant. The design was modernist, angular, visual free jazz. The album hit stores in November 1959. By then, Ornette Coleman was already in New York City, about to stage the most controversial debut in jazz history. November 17, 1959. A snowy evening in New York's Bowery neighborhood. Outside the 5-spot cafe at 5 Cooper Square, a crowd gathered unlike anything the club's owners had seen. Leonard Bernstein, conductor of the New York Philharmonic, stood in line. So did Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Charles Mingus, Roy Eldridge, Coleman Hawkins. Every major jazz musician in New York seemed to have cleared their schedule for opening night. They had heard rumors. John Lewis had been talking up this Texas saxophonist for months. The album The Shape of Jazz to Come was starting to circulate. And jazz critic Martin Williams had written a rave review after seeing Ornette at Lenox. But nothing prepared them for what they heard when the quartet took the tiny stage. Ornette Coleman, wearing a suit, his white plastic saxophone gleaming under the stage lights, Don Cherry beside him with his pocket trumpet, Charlie Hayden hunched over his bass, Billy Higgins behind the drums, no piano. They opened with Lonely Woman, that slow bass dirge, those fast shuffling drums. The melody wailing between Ornette and Cherry, notes bent and twisted like blues vocals. And then Ornette's solo, phrases that seemed to come from another dimension, ignoring the jazz rules that everyone in that room had spent years mastering. The response was immediate and visceral. Miles Davis listened for one set and stormed into the kitchen to confront Coleman. "Man, what are you doing?" Davis demanded. "You're all screwed up inside." Davis left the club angry, though years later he would become a proponent of Coleman's innovations. Dizzy Gillespie, one of bebop's architects, listened carefully. His verdict: "I don't know what he's playing, but it's not jazz." But others heard something profound. Charles Mingus declared it, "like organized disorganization or playing wrong right. It gets to you emotionally like a drummer." Leonard Bernstein stayed for the entire set, then pronounced Coleman the most important development in jazz since Charlie Parker. John Coltrane returned night after night, sitting quietly at a table, absorbing every note. Years later, Coltrane would say Coleman helped him conceive albums like Ascension and Interstellar Space. Lou Reed, then a college student at Syracuse University, was so entranced that he followed the quartet around New York. Too broke to afford tickets, listening through windows. "I heard Lonely Woman, and that changed my life," Reed later said. But the hostility was equally intense. Alto saxophonist Lou Donaldson walked in, surveyed the scene, and walked out after one tune, muttering, "Something is happening here." Drummer Max Roach, furious at what he perceived as an attack on bebop's legacy, followed Ornette into the kitchen and punched him in the mouth. Days later, Roach stood outside Coleman's apartment shouting criticisms from the street. Critics like Leonard Feather, influential at Downbeat magazine, dismissed Coleman as anti-jazz. Others called him a charlatan, a fraud who simply didn't know how to play his instrument. The controversy exploded into the mainstream press. The New York Times covered the 5-spot residency. Time magazine mentioned Coleman. Suddenly, a jazz debate had become a cultural flashpoint. The club's owner had booked Ornette for 2 weeks. The engagement extended to 10 weeks, then 6 months. Every night, the tiny room packed with musicians, critics, intellectuals, and curious civilians trying to understand what all the shouting was about. Pianist Paul Bley, who had recorded with Coleman in Los Angeles, observed that Coleman's quartet made the popular hard bop group the Jazztet sound like Guy Lombardo, the king of schmaltzy conventional dance music. Novelist Norman Mailer, a regular at the 5-spot, recognized Coleman as part of a broader cultural upheaval. Poets Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso attended. Painters Willem de Kooning and Larry Rivers came to hear music that sounded like abstract expressionism. The jazz world couldn't ignore Ornette Coleman. The question was, had he revealed jazz's future or destroyed its foundation? What exactly was Ornette Coleman doing that provoked such extreme reactions? To understand, you have to understand bebop, the jazz language that dominated the 1950s. Bebop was built on chord progressions. A pianist or guitarist would comp through a sequence of chords, Ti-Vi for instance, and soloists would navigate those changes, choosing notes that fit each chord. Bebop was brilliant, complex, virtuosic, but it was also constraining. Every solo had to follow the harmonic roadmap. The chord changes were like train tracks. You could go forward or backward, fast or slow, but you couldn't leave the rails. Ornette Coleman asked a simple question. Why? In his view, melody should drive improvisation, not harmony. If a melodic phrase needed a note outside the chord, why not play it? If the emotional logic of a solo required shifting to a different tonal center, why wait for the chord progression to permit it? Coleman called his approach harmolodics, a philosophy where harmony, melody, and rhythm had equal weight, none dominating the others. In harmolodic improvisation, every musician in the ensemble had equal voice. The bassist wasn't just keeping time and outlining chords, he was creating melodic lines. The drummer wasn't just maintaining the groove, he was commenting on the melody. Coleman eliminated the piano precisely because it reinforced harmonic hierarchy. Without piano or guitar, his quartet could explore what he called free phrasing, improvisation based on melodic shapes, emotional contours, and real-time collective decision-making. Critics accused Coleman of playing out of tune, but Coleman argued he was playing natural intonation, letting notes bend and waver the way human voices do. His plastic saxophone, with its slightly off-key quality, actually enhanced this vocal approach. The rhythmic concept was equally radical. Coleman didn't reject swing, but he rejected metronomic time. He called it spread rhythm, time that could stretch and contract organically. You might tap your foot for a while, then stop, then start again, following the music's breath rather than a fixed pulse. This terrified musicians trained in bebop. How do you comp for a soloist if you don't know what key they're in? How do you keep time if the tempo is fluid? How do you know when the form repeats if there's no fixed number of bars? Coleman's answer? You listen. You respond. You trust. Gunther Schuller, who taught Coleman at Lenox, observed that Coleman's musical inspiration operates in a world uncluttered by conventional bar lines, conventional chord changes, and conventional ways of blowing or fingering the saxophone. But here's what Coleman's critics missed. He wasn't rejecting jazz tradition. He was extending it. Coleman studied Charlie Parker obsessively. He could play Bird solos note for note. But he recognized that Parker had pushed bebop as far as it could go. The only way forward was to step outside the chord changes entirely. Coleman also drew deeply from blues and folk music, traditions where melody and emotion mattered more than harmonic sophistication. Lonely Woman has a folk-like simplicity. So does Peace. These weren't atonal avant-garde exercises. They were songs you could hum. In fact, Coleman always insisted his music was deeply traditional. He was drawing on field hollers, work songs, gospel, Black American music that existed before European harmonic systems colonized jazz. This is why Leonard Bernstein understood Coleman immediately. Bernstein, a classical conductor, recognized that Coleman was working with melodic development techniques found in Beethoven and Mahler, stating a theme, fragmenting it, varying it, recombining it. Pianist Bill Evans, who played on Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, compared Coleman's improvisational approach to Japanese Zen calligraphy, the art of spontaneous creation where each brushstroke is both planned and improvised. Coleman's compositional structures reflected his philosophy. His heads, the written themes, were often simple, even childlike. Lonely Woman is essentially a folk melody. Peace sounds like a children's song. But these simple themes could support infinitely complex improvisation. The chord-free approach also meant that time itself became flexible. Lonely Woman creates that temporal mystery through its dual tempo structure. Are you supposed to feel the slow bass pulse or the fast drum shuffle? Coleman's answer: both or neither, or whatever you feel. This was revolutionary. Before Coleman, jazz had grown increasingly complex harmonically, but remained metrically rigid. Coleman flipped that equation: simple harmonies, complex time. To understand the shape of jazz to come, you have to understand 1959, possibly the most revolutionary year in jazz history. In August, Miles Davis released Kind of Blue, the best-selling jazz album of all time. Davis had stripped away bebop's harmonic complexity, focusing instead on modes, scales that gave soloists freedom to explore melodic space. The album was cool, spacious, meditative. In December, John Coltrane released Giant Steps, bebop taken to its absolute limit. The title track cycled through key changes in major thirds at breakneck speed, so harmonically complex that even virtuoso musicians struggled to navigate it. Dave Brubeck released Time Out, experimenting with odd time signatures like 5/4 and 9/8. Charles Mingus released Mingus protesting the commercialization of jazz with compositions that were simultaneously accessible and uncompromising. And Ornette Coleman released The Shape of Jazz to Come, which rejected the entire harmonic foundation that all those other innovations still relied on. The albums represented different paths forward. Davis's modal approach influenced countless musicians: Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, the entire fusion movement. Coltrane's harmonic complexity inspired progressive jazz artists. Brubeck's rhythmic experiments opened doors for later musicians. But Coleman's impact was the most divisive and most profound. He wasn't offering a refinement of bebop. He was offering an alternative to bebop, a parallel jazz tradition based on different principles. Initially, Kind of Blue overshadowed The Shape of Jazz to Come. Davis's album was immediately accessible, beautiful, cool. Coleman's album sounded alien, confrontational. But over time, Coleman's influence spread. By the mid-1960s, free jazz had become a movement. Saxophonists like Albert Ayler, Archie Shepp, and Pharoah Sanders cited Coleman as their primary inspiration. Pianists like Cecil Taylor and Paul Bley explored similar territory. The entire loft jazz scene in 1970s New York traced its lineage to Coleman. Coltrane himself underwent a radical transformation after hearing Coleman. Albums like Ascension and Interstellar Space showed Coltrane incorporating Coleman's harmonic concepts into his own spiritual quest. Even rock musicians paid attention. Lou Reed's Velvet Underground incorporated noise and dissonance inspired by Coleman. Punk bands in the late 1970s saw Coleman as a kindred spirit, someone who rejected the rules and made it personal. The Minutemen, a hardcore punk band, cited Coleman as a major influence. Bassist Mike Watt said, "Ornette made us realize you could make your own sound." After the five-spot residency ended in early 1960, Ornette Coleman was famous and broke. He released a string of albums on Atlantic: Change of the Century, 1960, This Is Our Music, 1960, and most controversially, Free Jazz, 1961, a 37-minute collective improvisation by a double quartet that pushed his concepts to their absolute limit. The albums were critically divisive. Downbeat magazine assigned 2 critics to review Free Jazz. Pete Welding gave it 5 stars. John A. Tynan gave it 0 stars. The magazine's first ever 0-star review. But commercial success eluded Coleman. Free jazz albums didn't sell. Club owners hesitated to book him. His marriage to poet Jane Cortez fell apart in 1964. Coleman developed ulcers from the stress. He felt attacked from all sides, accused of charlatanism by traditional jazz musicians, exploited by club owners and record labels, misunderstood even by the avant-garde. In 1962, after releasing Ornette and Town Hall 1962, Coleman largely withdrew from public performance. For the next 3 years, he took time to teach himself trumpet and violin, further expanding his sonic palette. When he re-emerged in 1965 with a trio featuring bassist David Ezenson and drummer Charles Moffett, his music had grown even more abstract. Albums like At the Golden Circle Stockholm showcased Coleman playing all 3 instruments, alto sax, trumpet, and violin, with unorthodox self-taught techniques. He composed symphonic works, including Skies of America, 1972, performed by the London Symphony Orchestra with Coleman as soloist. The piece attempted to translate harmonics to classical orchestration. In the mid-1970s, Coleman formed Primetime, an electric band featuring 2 guitarists, 2 bassists, and 2 drummers. The music fused jazz with funk, rock, and world music. Albums like Dancing in Your Head, 1976, influenced the no-wave movement in New York and later helped birth jazz-funk fusion. But Coleman remained on the margins of the jazz establishment. While Miles Davis became a superstar playing fusion, Coleman struggled for recognition. While John Coltrane achieved sainthood before his death in 1967, Coleman was still considered controversial. He lived modestly in Harlem, rarely touring, occasionally performing in small venues. The phrase free jazz, taken from his 1961 album title, became attached to any avant-garde jazz, often music Coleman himself didn't recognize as connected to his own concepts. Coleman felt misunderstood. He insisted harmolodics was about liberation, not chaos, about listening, not self-indulgence, about melody, not atonality. But the jazz world seemed determined to categorize him as an outlier, a radical, someone outside the tradition rather than expanding it. Recognition came slowly, almost reluctantly. In 1984, the National Endowment for the Arts named Coleman a jazz master. In 1994, he received a MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Grant. But the real turning point came in 2007. Coleman released Sound Grammar, his first album of new material in 10 years, recorded live in Germany in 2005. The album won the Pulitzer Prize for Music, making Coleman only the second jazz musician ever to receive the award, after Wynton Marsalis. That same year, he received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Suddenly, at age 77, Ornette Coleman was being celebrated as a visionary. The same institutions that had dismissed him 50 years earlier were now honoring him as a pioneer. The Shape of Jazz to Come was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2015, just months before Coleman's death. The Library of Congress had already added it to the National Recording Registry in 2012, recognizing its cultural and historical significance. The Penguin Guide to Jazz awarded the album its highest accolade, a Crown rating reserved for essential masterpieces. Rolling Stone ranked it among the greatest albums of all time in every edition of their list. Musicians who had studied Coleman's work for decades spoke openly about his influence. Pat Metheny recorded an album with Coleman in 1986, Song X, calling it one of his most important projects. Branford Marsalis, Wynton's brother, defended Coleman's innovations. Joshua Redman covered Coleman compositions. But perhaps the most poignant vindication came from John Coltrane's legacy. In archived interviews, Coltrane had always spoken reverently about Coleman. After Coltrane's death, musicians realized that Trane's final albums, the ones that confused even his devoted fans, were directly inspired by conversations with Ornette. Coleman had opened a door that Coltrane walked through. On June 11, 2015, Ornette Coleman died of cardiac arrest in Manhattan. He was 85 years old. His funeral became a 3-hour celebration, with performances and speeches from collaborators spanning 6 decades. So what did The Shape of Jazz to Come actually accomplish? First, it proved that harmony was optional. Before Coleman, all jazz, swing, bebop, cool, hard bop, shared one assumption: chords mattered most. Coleman demonstrated you could create compelling, swinging, emotional music without conventional harmonic structures. Second, it established collective improvisation as a valid approach. In bebop, the rhythm section accompanied the soloist. In Coleman's music, everyone was a soloist simultaneously. This influenced everything from free jazz to jam bands to modern indie rock. Third, it reconnected jazz with its folk and blues roots. Bebop had become increasingly intellectual and European-influenced. Coleman reminded musicians that jazz came from work songs, field hollers, the blues, traditions that prioritized emotion and melody over harmonic sophistication. Fourth, it liberated rhythm from the metronome. Coleman's spread rhythm influenced not just free jazz but also funk, hip-hop, and electronic music. The idea that time could breathe, stretch, contract organically became central to contemporary music production. Fifth, it challenged the concept of correct intonation. Coleman's bent notes, vocalized tones, and microtonal playing anticipated everything from punk rock's raw aesthetic to the pitch manipulations in modern auto-tuned pop. Most importantly, The Shape of Jazz to Come taught musicians that rules were guidelines, not laws. You could reject chord changes. You could use a plastic saxophone. You could eliminate the piano. You could follow your ear instead of theory. This philosophy influenced musicians far beyond jazz. Punk rockers like the Minutemen and Mission of Burma cited Coleman as proof you didn't need to play like professionals to make meaningful music. Lou Reed incorporated Coleman's noise aesthetic into the Velvet Underground. Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore called Coleman the godfather of punk. Coleman's concept of harmonics even influenced hip-hop producers, who sampled his work and adopted his idea that every element in a mix should have equal weight, not just melody dominating over rhythm. Lonely Woman remains Coleman's masterpiece, a composition so perfect that it became a jazz standard despite breaking every rule. The melody is heartbreakingly simple, just a few notes really. But those bent pitches, that mournful quality, the way it floats over the dual-tempo rhythm section, it's unlike anything before or since. Musicians who cover Lonely Woman face an impossible choice. Stay true to Coleman's radical approach or make it fit conventional structures. The modern jazz quartet chose the latter, adding piano harmonies and smoothing out the rhythms. Their 1962 version is beautiful but tame. Charlie Haden's multiple covers, with Old and New Dreams, on Etudes, on In Angel City, try to honor the original spirit while making it accessible to wider audiences. Pat Metheny's versions go the opposite direction, embracing the harmonic approach fully. Metheny understands that Lonely Woman isn't a song so much as an emotional landscape you enter. Eventually showcases Coleman at his most bebop-influenced. It swings hard, moves fast, and sounds closest to conventional jazz. Yet even here, Coleman's phrases push beyond the boundaries, creating tension between the familiar and the alien. Peace demonstrates Coleman's melodic gift. It's gentle, almost pretty. Proof that free jazz didn't have to be harsh or confrontational. The composition sounds inevitable, like it had always existed, waiting for Coleman to discover it. Chronology is the most enigmatic track. Its melody angular, its structure elusive. Coleman and Cherry trade phrases over Haden's walking bass and Higgins's crisp drumming. It sounds like bebop from another dimension, familiar yet utterly strange. Together, these 6 compositions created a template for everything that followed. The language Coleman invented on this album became the foundation for an entire genre. Stand in a record store today and look at the jazz section. You'll see albums by Coleman disciples like Pat Metheny, Vijay Iyer, Chris Potter, and Kamasi Washington. You'll see the influence in hip-hop, artists like Flying Lotus and Kendrick Lamar sampling free jazz aesthetics. You'll see it in indie rock bands like Radiohead, who cite Coleman as an influence on albums like Kid A. The language Coleman invented in 1959 became so pervasive that we don't even notice it anymore. When a contemporary jazz musician plays outside the changes, they're using Coleman's vocabulary. When a rock band abandons traditional song structure, they're walking through doors Coleman opened. When a hip-hop producer creates a beat with shifting tempos and ambiguous keys, they're applying harmonic principles. The Shape of Jazz to Come, sold modestly in 1959. It took decades to go gold. But its cultural impact was incalculable. The album proved that an outsider with a plastic saxophone could redefine an art form. That rules existed to be questioned. That the future of music belonged to those brave enough to trust their ears over theory. Coleman spent his life defending his vision against critics who never understood that he wasn't destroying jazz. He was revealing what jazz had always been beneath its European-influenced surface. A music of freedom, emotion, collective spirit, and melodic truth. In 2012, when the Library of Congress added The Shape of Jazz to Come to the National Recording Registry, the citation read, "This album introduced listeners to revolutionary concepts that anticipated free jazz and signaled the direction that modern jazz would take. The revolution took 60 years to be fully recognized, but it never stopped happening. Every time a musician picks up an instrument and decides to follow their instinct instead of the rulebook, they're living in the world Ornette Coleman created on May 22, 1959, in a Hollywood studio with a plastic saxophone and a quartet of believers. The shape of jazz to come turned out to be the shape of all music to come. Open, exploratory, democratic, free. Ornette Coleman didn't predict the future. He gave musicians permission to create it themselves.